Hello and welcome to Railway Mania. This episode is very much a technical one, following on from episode 2's insight into articulated locomotives, particularly Mayas and Fairlies. This time we are looking at one of the most successful types of bendy locos, the Garratt. In case you haven't heard episode 2, let's start things off with a quick recap on why articulated locomotives were created. Railways are and always have been expensive to build, but they are efficient because there is very little rolling resistance from steel wheels on steel rails, requiring less energy to move loads than other forms of transport. However, the lack of a large gripping surface means that it is difficult for them to climb hills. If you add more driving wheels to the steam loco, you get more adhesion. Adding more driving wheels means that the locomotive becomes very long and not very bendy, making it hard to go around curves. Unfortunately, steep railways often end up being curvy railways as well. An articulated locomotive splits the driving wheels up into two or more groups, at least one of which can swivel, meaning that the fixed wheelbase of the loco is kept to a minimum, but the number of driving wheels can be increased. Maya's solution was to have two articulated bogies and one boiler. Both these designs were improved over the years, most notably by locomotive manufacturers Kitson, who created the Kitson Maya, but both of them had drawbacks. In 1907, Kitson were approached by an engineer named Herbert W. Garratt, who had a brand new design of articulated locomotive. Born in 1864, Herbert Garratt had had a varied career and had been working abroad in Peru. He had seen Kitson Maya locos at work there. The genesis for his own design is not known, but it is said to have been inspired by combining the principles of the Kitson Maya with the method of some wagons designed for carrying artillery, with the long heavy load slung between two trucks. Garratt's method was simple: take the driving bogies of the Maya design and move them out from under the boiler, meaning the boiler and thus the firebox could be enlarged into the new space created. On top of the front driving bogie would be a large water tank, whilst more water and the coal could be carried on the rear bogie behind the cab, much like a tender engine does. Each bogie would be articulated and able to swivel, meaning that the fixed wheelbase was only the length of the bogie. Having a single boiler meant that it was cheaper than the Fairlie to build and maintain, as well as being able to carry far more fuel, and the fact that the boiler was large with a nice deep firebox meant that it would be able to steam better than the long boilers of the Malays or the Mayas. Kitson were not interested and turned Herbert down, as did several other manufacturers. Undeterred, he filed a patent for his idea in July 1907. The next month, Garratt took a job with Australia's New South Wales Government Railways, which had placed an order for 50 locomotives with the Manchester-based firm of Beyer Garratt. Locomotive manufacturing was big business in Britain during the late 19th century, with many locos being constructed for export. In the 1900s, this tide was on the turn as railways around the world began to build more of their own locos, and Beyer Garratt needed an edge. Garratt teamed up with the in-house draftsman Samuel Jackson, not to be confused with Samuel L. Jackson, who lives a very different life and to my knowledge has never designed a steam locomotive. Jackson revised Garratt's early sketches, and the design was resubmitted for a new patent in January 1908. The excitement was such that Garratt quit his job in September — history does not record how the New South Wales Government Railways felt about this — so that he and Beyer Garratt could pursue the construction of this new design. Beyer Garratt were the only UK manufacturers permitted to build these locos. At that time, the firm had been contracted to build some new Malays for a railway on the other side of the world in Tasmania, the 2-foot gauge North East Dundas tramway. Beyer Garratt convinced the buyers that this new Garratt design would be more suitable, and in 1909 the first two locos were built, K1 and K2. Two things set these prototypes apart from those built later. The first was that, like a Maya, the cylinders pointed inwards towards the centre of the loco. The second difference was that they were compounds. This meant that steam from the boiler first went into small volume high pressure cylinders under the cab. The same steam was then fed into large low pressure cylinders at the front, using the steam twice and creating a softer exhaust blast up the chimney. K1 and K2 were indeed a success, though they had a tendency to lose traction on 50-ton trains as the local climate is exceedingly wet. The next order came in 1910 for the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway in India. This was even more mountainous and steeply graded than the Tasmanian route, as it climbs 7,000 feet in less than 50 miles. This is an adhesion-worked railway that has no rack system. Beyer Garratt were keen to sell the operators on the idea that this new locomotive could do the work of two of their existing types. The firm had actually been offering to supply a locomotive on a 3-month trial for free, but the catch was that if the trial was successful, you had to pay up for the first one and another 2 were ordered automatically. The Darjeeling did not go in for this deal, but did agree to purchasing an 040 plus 040 Garratt. This was not a compound and instead fed all 4 cylinders directly from the boiler. Sadly, trials were a bit of a letdown. The locomotive was powerful, but the Darjeeling is incredibly steep, meaning that as water from the front tank was used, the weight on the front bogie decreased and it slipped with heavy loads. What's more, doubling the power and doubling the length of trains had its own problem. As anyone who's ever had a train set on the carpet and tried to get a long train around a sharp corner can probably tell you, at some point the sideways force on the couplings and the wagons will overcome the wagon's ability to stay on the rails, and in trying to cut the corner they all come off the track. On the extremely sharp curves of the Darjeeling Himalayan, this is exactly what happened. Coupled to this was the poor efficiency of the loco. It had twice the power of the older conventional locomotives, but it used more than twice as much coal. Indian railways can be a harsh environment to operate in, and a complex machine like this was perhaps not the best solution at the time. Once the Garratt was reallocated to a less steep section, it was able to carry on working until withdrawn in 1954. A trickle of orders came in over the next few years, primarily for railways in the Belgian Congo, and these machines met with more success. 1911 produced an order for a much larger loco design, a 3-foot 6-inch gauge 260 plus 062 Garratt for the Western Australian Government Railways. In his book Engines That Bend, author David Joy describes an instance of customer care on the part of Beyer as the company sent the locomotive along with 6 different size and shaped nozzles for the blast pipe, so that the owners could try them all out and report back which worked best. This was because of problems with steaming experienced with the Darjeeling Garratt, and it worked because the following year they received an order for more locos and the specified blast pipe thanks to the testing, and this order was in turn followed by another from the Tasmanian Government Railways for more Garratts. It looked like the design had finally overcome its initial hurdles, and orders began to flood in. One of the advantages of a Garratt design on sharp curves was that while the articulated front bogie of a Maya or Malay would follow the curve, the long boiler would throw its weight to the outside of the corner as it tried to go straight on. With a Garratt, the fact that the boiler was slung between the bogies not only meant it had a low centre of gravity, the boiler also cut across the inside of the curve, increasing stability and enabling greater speed. This was brought to the attention of one Tasmanian driver whose train derailed as he had not realised quite how fast he was going due to the smooth ride. Sadly, Herbert W. Garratt died at the age of 49 in 1913 and missed out on seeing his creation conquer railways around the world. Beyer continued to market the loco, particularly in Africa where the robustness of the design and light axle loadings made it especially suited to the harsh terrain. In South Africa, where the railways use 3-foot 6-inch or Cape gauge track, huge monsters like the GL class Garratts were built. These behemoths would dwarf most British standard gauge designs, and indeed were far more powerful. The loading gauge in Africa was far less restricted than Europe or the UK, meaning that enormous outside cylinders could overhang the sides of the loco, whilst vast boilers could be mounted between the bogies. In South Africa and Rhodesia, the Garratt was king of steam, and its dominance was not equalled on any other continent. This owed a lot to the involvement of one of the best locomotive salesmen in the world, W. Cyril Williams. Williams had been in Durban during trials of Garratts in 1920, and was so impressed that in 1923 he took up a job with a manufacturer. His job was to sell what was an expensive product for its time, but one that was very capable. Williams travelled the world evaluating existing designs, reporting back, and selling in the articulated type to new customers. David Joy states that Williams travelled 45,000 miles in 1926 alone. The design failed to gain favour in North America. Baldwin had the manufacturing rights but did not make any, citing restricted fuel capacity when compared to conventional locos and Malay types. South America, long-time advocates of articulated locos, were more keen on the design. For example, our old friends from episode 2, the Trans-Andine Railway, bought Garratts to supplement their kits and Mayas, and indeed on some sections it was not unusual for one type to be banking the other, which must have been quite a sight and sound. Australia continued to order more with success building on success, but the introduction of Garratts to New Zealand was a failure. As with the Darjeeling, the attempts to drag trains of twice normal length had issues. The sheer weight of the trains would regularly snap couplings, and the 462 plus 264 Garratts were as prone to slipping as the Darjeeling example. Eventually they were broken up and the parts used to make 6 conventional Pacific locos. Other manufacturers were desperate to copy Beyer success, and while the patent ran out in 1927, meaning companies like Hanomag and Krupp in Germany could begin building their own Garratts, some builders tried to jump the gun, including Armstrong Whitworth in 1924. Armstrong Whitworth had not built articulated locos before, and Beyer smelled a rat, managing to inspect the locos before they were exported. Caught red-handed in a case of copyright infringement, Armstrong Whitworth had to agree not to make any more until the expiry of the patent. They weren't the only ones. In another cheeky move, the North British Locomotive Co. came up with a modified Fairlie design, which should really be described as a modified Garratt to try and get around the patent. The fact that German manufacturers had supplied Garratts to British colonies so angered Beyer Peacock that the board meeting of 1931 was lively, to say the least. The outcome was that a new patent was taken out and renamed the Beyer Garratt to distinguish itself from all others. At this time, the world was in the grip of the Great Depression, and locomotive orders had slumped. Towards the end of the decade, when the economy began to pick up once more, Beyer Peacock was able to use its new powers to subcontract Garratt building to outside firms such as Hanomag or Franco-Belge. War reared its ugly head once more, and Beyer Peacock's order book exploded, with the firm madly subcontracting locomotive building left, right and centre. New Garratts were being built in record time for places all around the world, supporting not only the supply of minerals and goods in Africa and Australia, but also directly serving the units fighting in places such as Burma. Beyer Peacock had feared that the end of hostilities would have meant the end of a need to supply locos, but the post-war boom brought the opposite. By 1945, Cyril Williams became sales director at the company, and continued to bring in more orders for more Garratts, to the extent he was sometimes known as Garratt Williams. Beyer Peacock had to bring in shift work for 7-day-a-week locomotive construction, and still they were unable to keep up with demand, even subcontracting North British in 1952 to fulfil an order for South Africa. In striking contrast to the war years, when the company managed to deliver 14 Garratts in just 118 days, when the East African Railways placed an order in 1950, they didn't get the first one until 1955. However, they stuck it out, and the locos worked tirelessly until the last one was withdrawn in 1980. Unfortunately for Beyer Peacock, the tide was turning and dieselisation was spreading by the mid-1950s. Seemingly overnight, Beyer Peacock turned from a company with more work than it can take on to one facing disaster. In 1958, the final Beyer Garratts, and indeed the final steam locomotives built by the company, were supplied to South Africa. The last one built has in fact been preserved and now resides in North Wales on the Welsh Highland Railway. South African Railways wanted more of the NGG-16 class in 1965, but Beyer Peacock was in the process of closing down, so they were subcontracted to Hunslet's South African associates, Hunslet Taylor, in 1968. This brought an end to Garratt production around the world. Beyer Peacock had built 1,023 Garratts, with other firms supplying 628. So, we've learnt a lot about the history of the Beyer Garratt as well as the technical design. But what are these machines like to live and work with?
So I wanted to speak to somebody who has expertise in working with articulated locomotives. So I'm speaking to Huw Jones now, who works for the Fairlie and Welsh Highland Railways, who operate a variety of locomotives, including several Garratts and Fairlies. Thank you, Huw, for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So can you give us an intro about yourself and how you came to work in your current job?
I started basically near enough straight out of school. My careers officer in school suggested that because I was interested in engineering, that I'd had a work experience from school in Boston Lodge down in Portmarnock. So we started off by going there for 2 weeks. That was in 2010, I think it was. And in one of the last couple of days of my time there as an on-work experience, the works manager came down and offered me apprenticeship. I didn't accept it there and then. I sort of kept it in mind after I went back to school then and found out other career options. I thought an apprenticeship would be better. And it just all went from there, really.
And how did you end up on the work experience scheme? Is it because, have you always been interested in steam locos?
At the beginning, it was not necessarily steam locos. It was just the engineering side of things, the mechanical engineering side of things. But as I've sort of worked with the locos, it has sort of grown as a sort of a side interest about various different types of locos, and especially articulated locos, which I do find quite interesting.
Would you say that you're now specialising in articulated locos?
Yes, probably. There's very few places in the world that do actually run them commercially, as the Fairlie and Welsh Highland Railways do. So there's little things about all locos that might not necessarily be obvious to people that work with normal steam engines as such.
So you've been working on and off with narrow gauge locos for just under 10 years then?
It's 10 years this month.
Wow. Brilliant.
Yeah.
What kind of projects have you seen in that time?
All sorts of stuff, really. Everything from rebuilding some of the home locos as such in Boston Lodge, like Prince, Blanche, a little bit on DLG. But then I've also done some work on locos for other railways. Isaac was one of them for down the Linton and Barnstaple Railway. Then I got moved from Boston Lodge up to Dinas, and that's when I really started working on NG16s. So.
And the Welsh Highland Railway really depends on these big Garratt locos.
Yes, yeah. At the moment, we have one diesel loco that can haul a 10-car train, but we prefer to have Garratts on the front because they work well within their operating margin, so we're not sort of straining them too much. However, the diesel, even though it's quite a powerful little engine or big engine, it's on its limit near enough.
So it's actually less capable than the Garratts.
Oh yes, yeah. So
That's not often something you hear about. Is that the more modern technology is inferior to it. These machines are taking 10 carriage loads up and over the tops down to Portmaddock.
yes, yeah.
What is special about these designs that makes them suited for this?
Particularly the NG16s, they're one of the most powerful locos on 2-foot gauge, if not the powerful actually. And because they're articulated design, they can go through quite tight corners. I think the design spec for them is about 2 chains curves. So that being, because they're good at going around corners, it works well with the old North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway, which was quite a winding railway. So it's that part of the design helps a lot with running them in this.
And is that because really the maximum fixed length is just the length of one of the bogies?
Yes, yeah. We're effectively running two 262 locomotives rather than one large loco.
Right. Then, so when it comes to maintenance, does this mean that the costs in time and effort, labour, everything else like that is doubled?
It's more or less doubled, especially mechanical wise, because obviously you have essentially 2 locomotives, running with each other. The only benefit as such is that you only have one boiler, and you only need 2 crew members, a driver and a fireman, to take the loco out, which I suppose is where articulated locos come from originally, I suppose, isn't it?
I guess in those days it must have been cheap. Like the cost of crew must have been your biggest expense.
It must have been, I presume so, yeah, because obviously going back to the early Festiniog days, that's why the double failures came into it, was to 1 set of crews and 2 locos.
On the Festiniog and Welsh Highland, we're almost seeing 2 ends of the development spectrum. So we've got the early days of articulated locos with the Fairlies, leading all the way up to the final incarnation in the form of the Garratt. What kind of build date are we looking at for these Garratts?
The earliest one we have is 87, which, off the top of my head, it was a 1937 engine.
So it's quite late in steam loco development.
Yeah, and the latest one we have is 1958, which is 143. That actually is the last Beyer Peacock locomotive to come out of Gorton Works in Manchester. So the very last one. And
it's still at work today.
Yes, we do have K1, which is the first Garratt engine that was built in 1909. But that's not running at the moment.
On and off.
Yeah.
What's your job in relation to the Garratts? I mean, what kind of work do you carry out on them?
Mainly, I sort of just repair them and keep them going. But at the moment, for the last sort of 12 months, maybe 18 months, I've been working on 130, which is a outside contract to rebuild an NG16, which will eventually run on the Welsh Highland Railway.
Right. So this is a privately owned locomotive?
Yes, it was in near enough scrap condition when it came to us. It sat in Exmoor Theme Centre for many years. I think it was early 90s. It came over from South Africa. When it got here, we had it in various different pieces, and it took us a couple of days just to get the wheels to turn because it was all seized up. I think that was about 4 years ago when it turned up. So, yeah.
And it had been sat outside for how long?
I think it was about 1994. I think it came over for a project up in Yorkshire, which eventually got abandoned. With this engine specifically, 130, I wasn't involved till about good 18 months ago, mainly because most of the work needed doing to it was things like welding and fabrication work to repair some of the parts on it. Things like wheel turning and that sort of stuff, which is not something I generally do. And the more, I would say, complicated machining work, that was all done by the machinists and the others at the works. So by the time then sort of all that had been done, it needed things like the copper pipework all been doing and the fitter side of the rebuild, and that's where I came in and I started working on it.
And then what tasks have you done since then?
Since then, I've done mainly copper pipework. I've done quite a lot of that. I've rebuilt injectors for it. I've done quite a lot of work on the reversing mechanism on it. Fitting that more than actually doing any physical work to it.
So for an articulated loco, is the reversing mechanism quite complex?
It's the Achilles heel, as such, of the locos, mainly because there is so much. On a normal engine, you'd have your reverser, and then you'd usually have one retrod going down then to the waste shaft, which then goes to the expansion links. But on the NG16s, from the bottom of the reverser, where the pin goes, you then have a shaft going back and forth to then 2 other intermediate shafts, which then have shafts then going over to the bogies, and then it gets to your waste shaft.
Wow. So there's a lot of room for movement in joints. And
Yes,
like
there's about 6 or 7 pins on each end of the loco compared to a normal engine. You just have 2. So there's a lot more potential to wear.
And what happens when those joints get worn?
When they get worn, they do what they go out of balance, and because of the design, one will fall into gear and one will fall out of gear. It's quite it's quite hard to explain it really. So
one drive unit will be under power and the other one will be in mid gear.
Essentially, yes. Because
so they'll be fighting with each other almost.
Almost, yeah. It can come to a point where they fight each other because because of the way they work, one is going backwards and one is going forwards. So the forward engine would drop further into gear, whilst the rear engine would come closer to mid gear. Or one end would be doing more work than the other end. It's
So to try and keep those in balance, you need all those links to be in tip-top condition.
Yeah.
I never even considered that.
No, it's something that quite a lot of people wouldn't generally think about. But we've been doing quite a lot of work recently with replacing the old South African design, which was just a bronze bush and a hardened pin. But we've been turning them to hardened pinned and hardened bushes, which seems to work miracles on the motion that they hardly ever wear. So we're hoping that it'll do the same on the reversing gear. Something else we've been doing is we've modified the South African design so we have a bit more adjustment in it, because something that it takes a while to try and set it up properly. The most important thing is getting the boiler unit set first, which most people wouldn't even consider doing because the reverse is in mid-gear and that's it. But because we have the 2 intermediate shafts on the NG16s, then you have to set them to mid-gear first. And then you find mid-gear on the power bogies, and then you sort of work it back to the boiler. Not very easy.
Yeah, there's so many things to think about compared to a standard loco.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing is born out of experience, I guess, at running these engines.
Yeah. It took me a while to get my head around it.
and those problems would not have become apparent unless they'd been in use for sustained periods of time.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, where the Welsh Highland comes into its own, I guess.
Yeah. We run services near enough day in, day out from I think it's March to October, so they do get quite a lot of work and quite a lot of wear does tend to creep in. So.
And then what are the challenges of looking after, in day-to-day service, a Garratt versus, say, a rigid-bodied locomotive?
Something that it does creep its head up every now and again. We finally decided, I think, to do something about it properly, as such, is the ball joint, where the live steam and exhaust steam come from each unit back onto the boiler cradle to go up the chimney. What we found is that the balls are starting to wear slightly, and as soon as lubrication is cut to them, which is essentially how they seal, it's just a metal to metal seal with an oil seal between them. There's no packing or nothing in that. It relies purely on that oil being between the two. And because of the over 50 odd years the engine's been running, the balls have started to wear in a slightly odd shape, so they're unique to each other.
Right, so they have to be operated in pairs.
So
the engine unit ball must be matched to the boiler unit ball.
Yes, yeah. The socket and the ball have to be near enough exact. So what we found is we had some trouble with 143, and we decided, because we had 87 in pieces, we'll try and use the ball joint off that. But as soon as we put it all together and tried to test it, it wouldn't work because the ball had worn in a slightly different shape. I think now we're looking at getting new castings made and having all them new. So we're in a bit of a safer position.
Hopefully these ones will last another 50 years, though.
Yes, yeah. I can imagine these will last quite well once they're sealed.
Yeah. So that's one of the problems that you have when you have an articulated loco, because on a more conventional loco, that would just be a rigid pipe.
More or less, yeah.
And we talked about this in the Fairlie episode, where they were trying out different solutions of having like a coiled pipe and things like that, but the ball joint seemed to be the best solution.
It seems to be, yeah.
And is that what they use on the Fairlies now?
The Fairlies are quite lucky to an extent, where they can use it's a 2-inch diameter PTFE line stainless steel braided pipe.
As a live steam pipe?
As a live steam pipe, yeah. Because of the way it's designed, even though it does flex around when it goes around corners, it doesn't flex as much in a single point, if you know what I mean. So the Fairlies used to have two ball joints, if I remember correctly, one at the top, one at the bottom, in a C-shaped pipe. But the NG16s is near enough a straight pipe through the pivot, or just above the pivot. So on the 16s, it has the ball directly over the pivot in in a very difficult place to get at. But there also has a telescopic joint further up, which is almost just the same as a piston gland type of arrangement. Again, oil fed, and that seems to do most of the sealing, because as the unit goes around the corner, the pipe can get slightly longer or shorter.
So it's almost like a drive shaft on a car or a truck.
Almost.
In that sense, where they can slide in and out of each other to compensate for the suspension.
Yeah. And something that I think it was the 1950 batch of Garratts onwards, they all had adjustable pivot centres. The idea being that you can adjust the wear out of them so they don't, wear the pivot pin as much. And because of that, when you adjust them up, they do come slightly shorter in wheelbase over the years. So also the telescopic joint is allowed for that.
So watch out, modelers. Depending on which year you do it, the wheelbase might be slightly different.
Yes. Yeah. Also, something that is starting to creep up is the fact that we're using 50-year-old components. But I suppose that's a general loco thing anyway.
But in such intense service as well.
Yeah.
So you're really seeing what needs replacing, what is life expired.
Yeah. Something that we have come up with quite recently is we fitted a ball valve into the injector steam valve on the fireman side, because we found that they were wearing so quickly we were replacing them near enough every 2 or 3 days, or working on them every 2 or 3 days. Out of curiosity, one day I asked one of our firemen, I gave him a little paint marker, and I said, every time you turn the injector on, can you just mark the side of the cab to see how many times it came on? And I think he stopped counting at 52, and he hadn't even got halfway yet. So what we decided to do was use the old valve, as such, the one that's on the manifold, as a shut-off more than anything. So it comes to it in the morning, turns it on, and then we have I think we've quite well hidden a ball valve. I don't think it affects the aesthetics of it that much underneath the foot plating in the cab. So it's much more reliable and a lot easier to work on.
Yeah, definitely.
to repair them.
So with Garratt number 130, then what is left to do on it before it can enter traffic?
Like most cases of locos, there's quite a lot of stuff that's been done sort of in reserve as such. So quite a lot of the work's been done, but it just needs final fitting as such. So there's the lubrication system on the rear unit, that's all been completed. We need to complete the main steam pipe on the rear unit, and again assemble all the ball joint arrangement and that sort of, all the telescopic bit of that. Then the front unit needs lubrication system fitting to it. Some of it's been made, but it just needs a refitting because it was painted. And then finishing off, again, live and exhaust steam on the front unit. The tanks are currently down in Boston Lodge, being some fabrication work being done to them. We're having the flanges underneath to carry the water to the injectors, all them's being fitted.
And in terms of this lubrication system, so with the Garratt being such a complex locomotive, is it a steam-assisted lubrication system?
Originally it was. Originally the steam lines that went into the cylinders and the valve chest, they were all atomised oil. For whatever reason, they removed that system, and we tend to run them just as a purely the oil system. There's a Wakefield 8-feed pump feeds everything via. There's 3 splitters on each unit too, and that seems to work fine. And
was that retrofitted in house?
On 130, yes. The lubricators were rebuilt by another gentleman, which I believe was a friend of the owner, Peter Best. And when they came over, we decided that we were going to fit new hardened camshafts to them, because mainly from experience from our locos, that new hardened camshafts, when you rebuild an engine, they last forever then. Something we also decided was that the old South African fittings, or rather the Wakefield fittings, originally fitted to the locos, they are quite labour intensive to keep them running. So what we decided to do was we've used modern lubrications components, which quite a lot of lead time, but they're near enough off the shelf. So that's non-return valves and 4-way splitters. And in I think the 10 years that 87's been running, that's had no problems at all, near enough for the lubrication system from the splitters and the non-return side of things. And yeah, the idea of that is that it reduces the man hours to repair, or get them working again rather, once they go. So that's something we're looking at recently is it has a old-fashioned ratchet arrangement to drive it, which in its South African days it was quite quite bulky and heavy and very prone to wear. But what we've done recently, we've redesigned the lubricated drive, so it's a lot lighter weight. The idea being that it doesn't thrash around underneath the engine and wear a lot quicker with modern clevis ends. So again, if they wear out, we can just put a new one on, in minutes.
So this is about day-to-day maintenance.
It's
improving the amount of time that the vehicle can be available for traffic.
Yes, yeah, that's the end goal. I think we're aiming for is having. It's quite obvious in my eyes. The less time it spends in the workshop and the more time it spends in front of a train, is the more money it'll earn, and the more people get to enjoy seeing. I personally like to try and improve things on the maintenance side of things, so it's a lot easier to maintain. It might be just a case of changing the odd bracket so it's slightly different, so you can get it off a lot quicker. It's just something that we try and improve.
And that's something that you probably couldn't figure out in a draftsman's office. That's something that, again, using them every day, you get that experience of what wears out, what needs replacing, how to access things properly.
Yes, yeah, that's mainly what we've been doing. We've been running these engines for 20 odd years now, and we're still doing slight modifications to them. I know the latest thing that we're going to try and trial on one of the engines is, rather than have the old-fashioned ratchet system on the lubricated drive, we're going to try to put what's known as a sprag clutch in there, which is the basic way of explaining it is a one-way ball bearing, with the idea being that if that ever fails, which personally I've quite a lot of faith in it, I think they'll last quite well, but if it does fail, it'll just be a case of, right, we have another one on the shelf, fit that and off it goes. Whilst the old-fashioned ratchet type, you had to sort of open up and inspect, right, is it the pawl wheel that's gone, is it the pawl that's gone, is it the spring that's gone? Yeah.
And how many of these kind of modern solutions to these problems would you say are incorporated into the locos as they are now?
I'd say that there's quite a few. Everything from the even the sanders, they've been changed. I wouldn't say in recent years, but by the time they've been here, we fitted essentially air sanding equipment off. I think they're off class 08 shunters, and we've modified the steam jet slightly, or the air jets rather, so it can take steam purely to use less sand. Because the old South African design, as soon as you open the valve, it dumped half the sandbox on the rail. We do have some problems with the sanders, but we're slowly ironing them out. We've put things like Vesconite bearings in 130, which I'm quite interested to see what happens. I'm not 100% sure what it is, but from what I understand, I think it's a plastic somewhere between PTFE and nylon. We've used all that on all the crank pins on all the rods, and it's meant to be almost wear resistant to an extent. I know there's various engines down in places like, I think it's the South Devon Railway, which have had a lot of success with this sort of stuff. So we're looking into that to see if it's any value to our engine. I know 138 is currently running with Vesconite on the bottom of the pivot where it sort of wears, just to see sort of what happens. And
so it's almost like a replacement bearing surface.
Yes, yeah, that's the best way of describing it.
And that really is a modern solution, because that stuff didn't exist when the locomotives were built.
No. And what I find quite sort of a coincidence is that this stuff was developed in South Africa. Yeah.
There you go. One more thing I want to talk about was the braking systems that are incorporated on the locos that you operate. Are there separate train and loco brakes on each one?
Yes. They originally had steam brakes. They had a relatively small steam cylinder in each rear corner of each power bogie. That was the first incarnation of the Garratts. The NG 13s also had that, the type before this. From experience in running 87, the 87 was fitted with one relatively small vacuum cylinder and the steam braking arrangement, and the braking on that was not as efficient as the others. So again, an improvement we've done is we've ripped all that system out, we've put new braking in. But yeah, they have a loco brake and a train brake, all vacuum, and obviously a handbrake on the loco.
I'm guessing by that point that most of the trains it was operating were fitted?
Yes, I think most, if not all, the South African trains were fitted with vacuum brakes. All of our trains in the Welsh Highland are fitted with vacuum brakes. I think most at least on the Festiniog are vacuum fitted or through piped.
And then how do the NGG16s compare to K1 in day-to-day service?
It's quite an interesting comparison. Obviously, K1's not quite as powerful. I think K1's only rated for about 6 or 7 carriages, while the 16s, they quite comfortably pull 10. But the biggest difference between the two of them is the compound arrangement on K1. So it has the high pressure cylinders at the rear end underneath the cab, and then it has the low pressure at the front. The exhaust from the rear unit powers the front unit.
So the steam has to travel down the length of the locomotive,
Yes.
back on itself.
The main steam pipe on K1 actually comes off, I think it's on the side of the firebox, where the regulator is. And then it goes down under the cab, into the rear unit, goes through the rear unit cylinders, expands slightly obviously in the cylinders, then goes to the front unit, expands even more, and then sort of comes up the chimney at not a great sort of velocity, which is a problem that when I fired the engine is something I found was, so you just crack it the blower on, and that seems to overcome it quite well. And
so is it not creating enough of a draw through the fire?
That's what most firemen seem to find with it, and tip that sort of quite a lot of drivers as they passed around each other was you drive it like you stole it to an extent, where you'd keep it quite well notched into gear. So it does give it a bit more fierce blast to keep itself going. I think I'm right in saying that K1 is the only compound Garratt.
Why do you think that wasn't carried on? Was it just mechanical complexity?
Partly, but I think it was partly because that it wasn't as efficient as they thought it would be, and the probably the slight gain in efficiency, you lost it by it was quite a unique engine to drive.
If we're comparing locos for efficiency on the same load, how would, say, a conventional loco like, say, Russell or something like that, compare in efficiency with a Garratt in fuel use over the same course of time?
I'd imagine something like Russell would be, obviously it's got only the 2 cylinders, but compared to a Garratt, sort of scale-wise, it would have quite a long, narrow boiler, whilst compared to the Garratts, they have quite short, stubby boilers. Quite wide fireboxes, because you can make maximum use of the width of the engine. You don't have to bother putting tanks on the side because they carry water and coal are carried front and back. You can have a slightly bigger firebox, which gives you more heating area. So I'd imagine, sort of, if you try and compare the both, I'd imagine the Garratts will be slightly more efficient, mainly for that reason. What size boiler you can put into them,
whilst being able to pull much more. So
yeah.
So size for size. So in an equivalent day, they probably use more fuel. But what you can get out of them is so much more than a conventional locomotive.
Yes.
In operation, then, one of the criticisms levelled at the Garratt was that as it uses fuel, the load on the bogies gets lighter. Is that something you've had experience of?
My personal view, I think that's nonsense, because that's true on any tank locomotive, really. Obviously, as you use water from the tanks, it's not you're losing that adhesive weight, because at the end of the day, you still have 14 tons of boiler and all the tanks and everything on top of it anyway. So yeah, you'll probably lose some, but I don't think it's the criticism hasn't got much sense in a way in my eyes.
And that's not something you've had experience of on the Welsh Highland? Not
really, no. I wouldn't say it, because they seem to operate fine, whether being fully loaded down in Carnarvon or with a half a tank and half a bunker full in Rhydd, so that they seem to have no problems at the loads we're talking about anyway.
Say the average journey starts in Carnarvon. Then what kind of techniques do you need to use at which points in the line? I
tend to fire the little and often method. When we're in Carnarvon, I'll put sort of a round of coal, or a decent round of coal on as we're sort of just getting ready, and then as we're leaving the station, I'll put a couple more shovelfuls on. Something that you see quite a lot with people that fire on the Festiniog and the Welsh Highland Railway, where they on the Fairlies they tend to pick up water quite easily, so they run them with about a third of a glass at the most, which is quite low for some locomotives. But with the NG16s, you can quite easily run them with the water in the top nut. I mean, when I fire, if I can see the water, I try to put some in.
Right.
That's how I do it.
And is that just because of the sheer capacity of the boiler?
Yeah, the sheer capacity, and I think the fact that the takeoff for the regulator so far up, because it's such a larger boiler, it doesn't suck up the water as much. Yeah, that's something quite handy about the NG16s.
So there's less danger of going hydraulic with it?
Yeah, quite. Right. Personally, I've never hydraulic the Garratt, so I struggled to see how somebody could do it, to be honest.
Have you had an experience of working with Fairlies?
Mainly, it's very restrictive compared to an NG16, obviously because your cab is only, I think it's about 18 inches wide and about 5 foot long, compared to a 16 where you got a full conventional cab. And what some people struggle to get a grips with at first is because of you have the twin fireboxes. The technique for getting the coal into the corners right underneath the fire hole door can be quite difficult to master.
Are you in effect firing it from the side?
Yes, yeah. Obviously on a conventional engine, on a Garratt, your grate will be sloping away from you, so the doors at the back and the grate will be sloping away. but on a Fairlie, the grate slopes to the side. Front of the engine, obviously, or rear of the engine, but it'll be to the side of you. So that can be quite a challenge to master.
Yeah, and less room to swing the shovel around as well.
Near enough, no room to swing the shovel around.
And recently, the Festiniog, well, not recently, and within the last 15 years or so, the Festiniog's been converting its Fairlie locomotives back to coal from oil use.
Yes.
How has that been to get used to?
Personally, I did very little oil firing. From what I know from oil firing, I can imagine it would have taken a bit more forward thinking, because coal is much slower to react than oil would. So, for instance, if you're sitting in the station ready to go, you'll have to think, right, I need to put the coal on, and sort of try and anticipate how long it will take to catch and start burning efficiently. Whilst with oil, you can just sort of near enough just turn it up a bit, and it's not instant, but it's a lot more quicker reacting. And obviously the benefits of oil, you can just turn it off. Whilst with a coal engine, you can't do that without dropping the fire. So,
which you don't want to do.
No, you really don't want to do that.
You get into a lot of trouble with that. Are we going to be seeing a return of K1 at any point?
I'd like to see a return. As far as I know, I don't think there's any plans at the moment. I could be wrong, because obviously I don't know what's being discussed on the management higher up. But it'll be nice to see it running again at some point.
And at the similar sort of time to when the Garratts were acquired, were there several tender locomotives as well?
Yes, we have the two NG15s, which they're quite interesting in their own designs.
Why's that?
When you look at the loco, it's a 282 tender engine, but it effectively operates as a 462 loco, because I suppose you could very broadly define it that as an articulated loco, because the front pony truck is known as a KH truck. There is a name which I can't pronounce.
Kraus Helmholtz.
Kraut Helmholtz or something. Yeah. I refer to it as KH truck. It's a lot easier, and that influences the leading driving wheel into corners by a very, very clever sort of ball and pivot arrangement. So it's a very, very interesting design. But it'd be nice to see how that operates on the Welsh Highland Railway.
And is there when would we be able to see that?
Well, there's a group, specifically a volunteer group, that comes in to work on that. They've been doing quite a lot of progress recently on getting all the wheel sets sort of finished as such, ready to go, and quite a lot of work on the suspension. Hopefully, by the end of the year, we'll have a rolling chassis. The boiler's been sent away for assessing, so it's moving slowly but steadily, I'd say.
Were they both operated by South African railways?
Yes. Yeah.
So it would make almost an interesting reunion of the two designs.
It would be, yeah. And I know from some of the loco crews and staff that have previously gone over to South Africa and talked to people that actually driven and maintained these locos, quite a lot of them said that there was not much difference in power between a 15 and a 16.
Because to look at them, you think the Garratts would be so much more powerful.
You'd think so, yeah. I'm quite looking forward to seeing an NG15 run on the railway, because it'll be a nice comparison, and it'll be something different for the customers.
Absolutely, because I mean, how long has it been now that the Welsh Highland's been open for?
I think it was 21 years last year. I think it was.
Wow. So I mean, it really will be a change of scenery for them, I guess.
It will be, yeah.
Yeah. Huw, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise with us.
No worries.
Hope to see you again soon, and good luck getting not just the Garratt, but also all the other locos back in steam and staying in steam as well. I think that's the main challenge.
Yes, definitely a challenge at times.
Thanks again to Huw for coming on the show, and thanks to you for listening to another Railway Mania podcast. In order to keep this episode to a reasonable length, I missed out tons of information and stories. For example, I didn't even touch on the Garratts built for British railways, which could mean that we revisit this subject at a later date in more podcast episodes. If this subject interests you and you'd like to learn more, please buy a copy of Engines That Bend by David Joy. This book was my main source of information for this podcast and supplied all the background and history to Beyer Peacock and Herbert Garratt's creation. As always, I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. Please do subscribe and share it with your friends. Check out more episodes at railwaymania.net. We're also on all of the main social media channels. Thanks again, and hopefully I'll be back with another episode of Railway Mania soon.